Hi, everyone, or good evening, because it's 5 p.m. Thank you. I know it's really late, and I know we've been here really long, so I appreciate you guys coming and watching my presentation. It means a lot. I'm Sam. I'm studying philosophy, political science, and psychology in the College of Arts and Sciences, and I did an analysis of pandemics on carceral spaces in the United States for my research project. Before I start, I just want to give a very special shout out to my advisor, Professor Spencer Piston in the political science department. Without him, this literally would not be possible. He's not here, he wasn't able to come, but still, he's amazing, 10 out of 10. But, so obviously we are all aware that we are in a pandemic at the moment, and a lot of what we've heard about who's affected by the pandemic the most are vulnerable populations. And when you think of vulnerable populations, you might be envisioning a certain group of people. Maybe you envision your grandparents or other elderly people whose health puts them at a risk of contracting COVID-19. You might envision children who aren't able to get the vaccine and have weakened immune systems so that they're susceptible. You might envision people who already have other chronic illnesses that make them even more susceptible to get another illness. But one of the most vulnerable populations in the COVID-19 pandemic is actually people in carceral spaces, meaning people in prisons and jails. In fact, the majority of the largest single-site outbreaks in the COVID-19 pandemic occurred in prisons and jails throughout the United States. And despite the fact that vaccines are becoming widely available, it's still these populations that continue to see large numbers of outbreaks and infection rates during the COVID-19 pandemic. But this isn't the first pandemic that the United States has had in its history. And it's also not the first large-scale pandemic that we've had in the system of mass incarceration. And so that led me to question, are these numbers unique to the COVID-19 pandemic? Or if we look to history, has there been a basis of large, widespread infections in carceral spaces, including prisons and jails? So for my project, I conducted a literature review where I looked at past data, the stories of people who have been incarcerated, and other studies done into this topic for 4 specific pandemics in the United States history, which include the 1918 H1N1 pandemic, you might know it as the Spanish flu outbreak, as well as the 2009 H1N1 outbreak, again, you might know that better as the swine flu, the ongoing epidemic and pandemic of the HIV and AIDS outbreak that has continued into today, and the COVID-19 pandemic. And I was seeking to answer 3 main questions as I looked at the data. First, if we looked at the data regarding infection rates in carceral spaces across these pandemics, were the high rates of infection and outbreaks unique to COVID-19, or is there a basis that this has happened in the past and we just haven't been able to stop those outbreaks? And if that was the case, my next question was, what are any of the specific conditions that exist in prisons and jails that lead to such rapid and widespread outbreaks in these kinds of spaces? And based on those conditions that might have been perpetuated across a century, what can we do to make sure that if, God forbid, there's another outbreak of this scale, that this population is protected adequately so we don't see these large single-site outbreaks in the future? And so looking back at the data about infection rates in carceral spaces, I found that COVID-19 was not the first time that there were large single-site outbreaks during pandemics. In fact, across all 4 pandemics that I looked at, the Spanish influenza, during the swine flu pandemic, the HIV and AIDS, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic, some of the largest outbreaks of each of these diseases have been in carceral spaces in jails. I put some of the data on the screen, that's the easiest to contract, but one of the other issues regarding this topic is there's a huge lack of data because there haven't been the attention given to these spaces despite large outbreaks, meaning that we can't hold administrators in these spaces accountable when they're not showing us exactly who's being affected in carceral spaces and how often outbreaks are happening. But based on the limited data we have, it's already abundantly clear that going back a century, these single-site outbreaks are not unique to today's pandemic, which leads the question of why has there been a repeated outbreak in these spaces that haven't been stopped going into today's pandemic? And there have been a numerous amount of conditions that affect this, but I found 3 major findings across all 4 pandemics that might explain why there's these outbreaks in carceral spaces. And those include, first, overcrowding in U.S. carceral spaces. Second, a lack of access to healthcare in the United States, as well as a lack of screening and testing for infectious diseases during pandemics. So that first finding, overcrowding in carceral spaces, in the United States, most people that are held in carceral states are held in jails and prisons at the state level, And over 50% of those state jails and prisons are operating at overcapacity, meaning that there are more people in these spaces than they actually have the materials and the resources to support, meaning space, food, as well as medicine and access to healthcare. Because there are so many people in prisons and not enough space, this leads to the widespread of diseases, not alone in pandemics, but most diseases, in fact. It leads to an increase in not only a lack of ventilation, so the only place for diseases to go is to each other, but also physical contact. Because the more overcrowding in prison there's more violence between people in jails, as well as more people being housed in the same small conditions in cells because there's nowhere else to go. Because of these factors that I found across all 4 pandemics, overcrowding has been one of the biggest sources of these single-site outbreaks that we see in today's pandemic. Going into that second finding, a lack of access to healthcare, I found 2 major points across all pandemics that were concerning. First, a lack of treatment when it was available. Because across pandemics where vaccines and medication has been available, there have been barriers to not only funding for this treatment to people who are sick in carceral spaces, but even when they have been mandated to give out vaccines and treatment, administrators in jails have not been delivering what they need to. But in addition to a lack of treatment, there's also a lack of reporting of what's actually happening in these spaces. In fact, while during the COVID-19 pandemic, there's been a higher amount of reporting going on as regards to vaccines and testing, there's still an underreporting today of what's actually being given in prisons to how many people, and if everyone that needs a vaccine is getting it in these spaces. If we don't have that data and it's not being collected, as is mandated by the CDC and their guidelines for dealing with pandemics in carceral spaces, administrators cannot be held accountable for the protection that they are obligated to give to these vulnerable populations. And so the fact that there's a lack of treatment and an underreporting of treatment across 4 pandemics points to a larger systemic barrier in these spaces. And that last point, a lack of screening and testing for infectious diseases, actually has 3 main problems that I found. First, that even when there's testing available, the reality of the conditions of prisons between violence from other people in the prisons, as well as the people administering these carceral spaces, leads to a fear of the stigma of a positive test, where people don't want to be tested out of fear of what will happen to them if they do test positive. There's also a lack of testing before people are being sent to isolation. You might have either been a close contact and had to self-quarantine or self-isolate before getting tested, but in carceral spaces, that doesn't equate to an individual self-isolating. That can equate to solitary confinement, which we know has an extremely negative physical and mental impact on people in carceral spaces. And so the fact that across pandemics, people have been sent into this isolation without testing is a huge opposition to the physical health of people in these spaces. But in addition to a lack of testing, there's also inconsistent testing even in today's pandemic, meaning that even when carceral spaces are reporting that they're testing everyone they can, people in the carceral spaces have come out to state that that's not actually happening, and it's at the whims of whoever is administering these tests at the carceral spaces to determine who will be tested. So there's a lack of testing, and there's a fear of what happens in these spaces because of a positive test. So there's been a lot of conditions that have exacerbated pandemics over a century at least. And so that made the question of what can we do? How can we ensure that going forward, this vulnerable population is better protected in the event of a future pandemic? And the one answer that most experts have agreed upon in solving this problem is actually decarceration. The biggest agreement that exists today is that there needs to be less people in prisons and less people that are being sent into prisons. And that without decarceration, it's almost virtually impossible to stop these single-site outbreaks in the future. Another thing that's almost universally agreed upon is that the conditions of carceral spaces need to be improved, be it the access to hygienic conditions that people are seeing, as well as the amount of violence that takes place, And it's given a blind eye by people administering these carceral spaces, as well as people that are partaking in the violence that administer these spaces. Until conditions are changed such that people aren't afraid to go to a doctor, and people aren't worried that even coming in contact with another person in these spaces could get them sick, these pandemics will continue to see large single-site outbreaks in the future of these kinds of outbreaks. And another thing that was agreed upon is there needs to be better testing for infectious diseases in carceral spaces, and alongside that, better reporting of this testing. If people aren't tested and don't know if they're even sick, these outbreaks will continue to happen because they can't stop it at the source and make sure people get the treatment they need. And if that's not being reported, there's virtually no way to hold administrators accountable for the care that they need to be providing. Regardless of what is done, something must be done if we want to stop seeing these large outbreaks in vulnerable population in the event of a future pandemic. So thank you guys so much for listening to my research. If you have any questions, I think I went a little over time, but.
So questions for Sam?
So one question I have is, I guess, how do you foresee getting people to care about pandemics in prisons and jails when people don't even care about incarcerated people like on the day-to-day life? So like I'm thinking about even like the Prison Rape Elimination Act and like how that was implemented a while ago, right? And there's still so many issues. So I guess it's just like, how do you see people starting to care more about this?
That's a really good question, and I think I have the same worry that there have been a lot of discussions, not just about pandemics in carceral spaces, but about lots of the conditions of carceral spaces that are so problematic, be it racism, be it sexism, be it the fact that the numbers of incarcerated people in the United States are so high compared to the rest of the world. So that's a very good question, and one that I don't know I think I have the answer to. Personally, I think there needs to be more discussion about these kinds of realities for people that are in carceral spaces. I think people are able to turn a blind eye pretty willfully if they're not actively seeking these answers, because a lot of what we hear about in the news is determined by politics and people that are in power, and they benefit from a system of mass incarceration that we see today, so they don't want to have these frank, open discussions about the systems and spaces of carceral and incarceration. But I think there just needs to be a brighter light shined on it, more media pieces. I don't know if anyone's seen the documentary 13th on Netflix. It's a very good documentary about the history of mass incarceration. When that came out, there was a huge discussion about mass incarceration. So I think as long as people continue to have the discussion and continue to do research, it'll put the politicians' feet to the fire about continuing to care and solve these kinds of issues. So thank you for the question.
Yeah, so I think it's clear you're very passionate about this subject. So I guess I was just curious why you chose to focus specifically on incarcerated people instead of other vulnerable populations.
Sure. So I actually took a class with my advisor, Professor Piston, last semester, and it was about race and criminal justice policy in the United States. And the conditions of incarceration were just one of the topics, but throughout the course, just everything we read pointed to the fact that mass incarceration is not sustainable in the United States, but it also is just almost a form of cruel and unusual punishment, and there's people that would argue it is. So I was interested in specifically the pandemic, how are people being affected in these spaces, given there's a lot of articles that are written, but I feel like you don't really hear about it in the news. People aren't reporting it on the television. Usually when you hear about outbreaks, it's about people in your communities that are like your grandparents. There's schools that are having outbreaks, but people try not to talk about the reality, which is that in carceral spaces, these are where the outbreaks are happening. So I wanted to do a little more research across history, since there's not really any literature that exists that spans multiple pandemics. It's usually just case studies of one or the other, just to put that spotlight on and learn a little bit more.
Just one more question.
I'll go quick.
So you mentioned that there was underreporting despite the CDC obligation to report. Did you find any differences between whether or not private prisons or public prisons were better or worse about that?
I didn't find any differences. I honestly, across private and state-owned prisons, administrators are not willing to report a lot of what happens in their prisons, not just testing, but the conditions in which people that are in these spaces are being treated to. So it's a bigger issue than just the topic at hand. So the fact that I didn't find any differences speaks to the fact that it's a huge issue across both. Thank you for the question.
Let's thank Sam again.